Hello everyone, I am Lizzie and this is the second episode of The Real Deal. The Real Deal is a series in which I explore some of the real-life inspiration behind iconic horror movies, dramas, thrillers, and all the dark cinema in between. Today I am so excited to be covering the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Now this is an iconic horror movie. It's an entire franchise at this point. There's so many sequels and remakes. I'm going to be talking about the original 1974 version, and of course we're going to be covering the man who inspired the story himself. Now, fair warning, the movie is pretty disturbing. It involves cannibals, chainsaws, meat hooks, lots of torture, and the real life story behind it is just as, if not more disturbing. So if anything in that realm is not your cup of tea, I would suggest skipping this video. But if you want something that is a little less gory, then check out my previous video which covers The Shining, and of course stay tuned for my next episode. If you guys end up liking this video, please comment and subscribe and like this video. It's going to be really helpful for me to see what you guys like and what you want to see from me. As always, if you have an idea of a movie that you want me to cover, please drop a comment because I will happily add it to my list. So first we're going to be talking about the movie itself, how it was made, the plot, all of that craziness. And then in the second part of this video, I'm going to be telling you about the real life murderer who inspired this story to become a film. So for those of you who are kind of unfamiliar with Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it is a 1974 horror movie, and the basic plot is that it follows a group of friends, including two siblings, who are on their way to visit the siblings' old family homestead in rural Texas. They make it to the homestead. Along the way, there's some weirdness that occurs, but after they arrive, they do some exploring and they find a nearby house, which turns out to be the home of a cannibal family. The cannibal family end up hunting down the group and they have to try to escape with their lives. Texas Chainsaw Massacre was directed by Tobe Hooper. Tobe Hooper was a filmmaker from Texas. He was a professor at the University of Texas, I believe, in Austin, and he was also a documentary cameraman. So he was a pretty experienced filmmaker, but Texas Chainsaw Massacre was actually only his second film, and he also played a role in actually writing the story and producing it, so he was pretty involved in the making of the film as a whole. In multiple interviews, Hooper has said that his inspiration for Texas Chainsaw Massacre came from a couple different sources. The most credited source for this story is Ed Gein, the murderer that we are going to be talking about in the second half of this video. So he was inspired by Ed Gein. He was also inspired by kind of the political climate at the time. Because this movie came out in '74, it was right around the Vietnam War. And at the time, the media was kind of evolving and it was becoming more sensationalist. And with the Vietnam War, that was obviously a very horrific event for everyone involved. And there was a lot of deception. There was a lot of just focusing on this really gross part of humanity. And Hooper was really inspired by this to write a movie in which the villain wasn't a monster or some supernatural being, but an actual human, because he thought that could be the scariest thing of all, is just one human hunting down another. Interestingly enough, Hooper has also said that vegetarianism was a pretty strong influence on this movie. The whole plot of the movie basically follows this group of kids who are being hunted down and eventually eaten by this cannibal family, and Hooper said that that kind of mirrors human relationships with animals, because so many animals are just used for meat and then consumed by humans, and they have to endure these really horrific conditions and they're killed in these really brutal ways. So he wanted to kind of make a film about not necessarily animal rights, but just the meat-eating industry, and to kind of evoke in the audience that sense of fear and terror that a lot of animals feel before they are killed or slaughtered for meat. And it's kind of interesting to note that Guillermo del Toro, who is also an iconic horror movie director, and he did Pan's Labyrinth, which is one of my favorite movies, when he first saw Texas Chainsaw Massacre, he actually went vegetarian for 4 years because he was so impacted by this message and disturbed by it. Texas Chainsaw Massacre takes place in rural Texas, and Hooper intentionally cast all Texas actors for this movie because he was from Texas and he wanted to keep it really local. The film also had a very small budget. I've heard different numbers, but the main one that I found was it had around a $140,000 budget, which is incredibly small for a horror movie, especially because typically you need lots of money for special effects and props and all that kind of stuff. So they had a really small budget, so he was just keeping it local, hiring local actors and shooting nearby. So during the film, as I mentioned, this group of basically young adults is going around and they come across this house, and when they enter it, they encounter a cannibal family, and they also encounter their home, which is filled with human carcasses. It's decorated with bones and dismembered body parts and human skin that has been tanned and used on furniture. And the set is so disturbing. I think nowadays horror movies just go way over the top with gore. And this movie really stuck out to me because it's really disturbing, but it's also very practical, and I think that's what makes it so scary, is there wasn't any like CGI or anything. They used actual dead animals and real animal blood to decorate the sets. So because they had such a small budget, they really couldn't afford fake animals and fake blood and all this, so they went to local slaughterhouses and they picked up just dead animal carcasses and buckets of blood, and that's what they used to decorate the set. So that's really disturbing in and of itself. It's also important to note that they filmed this in Texas in the summer, which means that it was like 100 degrees when they were filming. The actor who played Leatherface, the main villain, his name was Hanson, and he has said that the filming experience was so unpleasant because he was in a mask while he was filming. In the movie, it's a mask made from a human face. So he was in a mask, and all of the actors were in this tight house in 100-degree humid weather with literal dead animals and animal blood just all around them. It was so bad that some of the actors had to regularly take breaks to go outside and vomit because it was so disgusting. And while I can't imagine working in those conditions, I think that it was the right choice, because when you're watching the movie, the house is just so creepy, and because it's all real, it just feels like something you might actually stumble upon in a rural area, which makes it just even more disturbing. Now, aside from the physical stress that the actors and crew were under having to work in those conditions, a lot of the actors also said that the shoot was really emotionally stressful. It's not only a physically stressful shoot, but it's also very emotional because they are supposed to be terrified. They're fighting for their lives. They're being hunted down. They're seeing their friends get killed off. It's just a very emotional event. And the main actress, Marilyn Burns, who, spoiler alert, ends up being the last survivor of the group, said that this was a really unpleasant movie for her to film because there was one scene in particular where she is at the dinner table in the cannibal's home and they're all kind of yelling at her and taunting her. She knows that some of her friends are dead, and she said that this was just a really high stress and unpleasant environment to film in. So they were shooting 7 days a week. I'm sure they were exhausted. I mean, they had this tiny budget. They were really just trying to crank it out as fast as they could. So it is interesting to note that while this film is a horror movie and it's highly disturbing, there isn't a ton of gore in it. And like I said, I think that this kind of adds to the terror. The reason that there's kind of minimal gore was, one, budget constraints, but also the director, Tobe Hooper, wanted the film to get a PG rating. And he was kind of advocating for this because he was like, look, there's not that much gore in it, you know, there's not that much blood. But of course the motion pictures, the MPAA, the Motion Pictures whatever something association, they basically decided that it was disturbing enough to warrant an R rating. I believe it was either rated X at one point, or they debated rating it X at one point. But due to the disturbing nature of the film, it was rated R, and because of the cannibal and chainsaw undertones, or overtones really, the film was actually banned in several countries for different periods of time. Some of these countries included Brazil, Germany, France, Ireland, places like that. Despite the fact that Texas Chainsaw Massacre was made on such a small budget, the film went on to gross over $30 million, which makes it one of the highest grossing indie movies of all time. And when it was first released, it received mixed reviews, But since then, it has come to be regarded one of the greatest horror movies of all time. And there are like countless movies and filmmakers and just pieces of culture that are influenced by Texas Chainsaw Massacre. A couple movies that were obviously influenced by Texas Chainsaw Massacre were Halloween, which was directed by John Carpenter. There are a number of parallels between Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The most obvious one is the fact that in both movies, the main villain is this large, faceless man who wears a mask throughout the movies. In Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Leatherface is more erratic. He does run, he wields the chainsaw. He has a very physically present role, even though he's mute. He doesn't say a single word in the movie, and that's exactly how Michael Myers is as well. But it's just their presence and their demeanor that is so terrifying. Wes Craven's movie, The Hills Have Eyes, was also obviously influenced by Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This movie is kind of similar in that it follows a group of cannibals in a rural area who hunt down a family, I believe. I personally have never seen The Hills Have Eyes, but I've heard of it. It's a very big cultural work. It's a very popular horror movie. So obviously the theme of cannibals hunting down people was paralleled in The Hills Have Eyes and inspired by Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So obviously Texas Chainsaw Massacre has been a very culturally impactful movie, and even over 30 years later, it continues to influence horror filmmakers and directors in general because of its unique style and just the way it changed the horror genre as a whole. Although Tobe Hooper has since passed, he did go on to direct several other notable works, including the TV miniseries Salem's Lot, which was inspired by the novel by Stephen King. And he also directed Poltergeist, which is usually associated with Steven Spielberg because I believe he either wrote the story or produced the movie. But Tobe Hooper was the one who actually directed Poltergeist. And spoiler alert, Poltergeist is on my list of movies that I plan to cover, so stay tuned for that episode if you are a fan. One of the reasons that Texas Chainsaw Massacre became such a hit is because it used a really interesting marketing campaign. It basically advertised the movie as being inspired by true events or being based on a true story. And people were really startled by this, obviously because the movie is so crazy, and it really worked to draw in audiences who were kind of horrified but also intrigued by the idea that this crazy movie could be inspired by a true story. So Hooper went on to say that there's not one true story that actually inspired this. There was no cannibal family that hunted down a group of kids or anything like that. But this use of kind of deceiving the audience by telling them it's a true story has been used so many times in the horror genre since the release of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Notably, The Blair Witch Project is one where it's kind of a found footage horror movie that convinces you that what you're watching is actual documentary footage. And yeah, that is a pretty common horror movie trope, I would say, nowadays, where they say based on a true story, even though it might be based on like one nugget of factual information. In this case, Texas Chainsaw Massacre was inspired by a true story though, and that is the story of Ed Gein. Gein is a pretty iconic criminal. If you're not familiar with him, he's well known for being a murderer who killed a number of people in Wisconsin in the early 1900s. Now, Gein was born in 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. And he had kind of a troubled childhood. His father was an alcoholic. He was always drinking, always drunk. And because of this, Gein's mother was really resentful towards his father. So they had a very strained relationship. It wasn't a very stable household. They ended up moving to Plainfield, Wisconsin, where they lived on a farm that had about 150 acres. So it was Gein, his mother, his father, and his brother Henry. Now, growing up on the farm, Gein was really involved in chores on the farm and things like that. And because the farm was so large and taking care of it was so involved, the family was very isolated, and Gein did not really leave the farm except to go to school. In school, it was said that he was a bit strange, that he kind of had trouble making friends, but overall he was a pretty good student. He was good at reading, and there wasn't anything super concerning about his upbringing. Now, starting in 1940, there was a series of events that were really traumatic for Gein and that most credit as kind of sparking his desire to kill people and mutilate their bodies. So in 1940, Gein's father passed away. As a result of this, Geen and his brother Henry had to start working a lot more. They just took up odd jobs around town, basically trying to cover living expenses so that they could all stay on the farm as a family and help their mother. Now, 4 years later in 1944, there was an incident where Geen and his brother were doing a burn of marsh on their property. So it was basically a controlled burn. And Geen claimed that during this, his brother went missing. So he called the police, he reported his brother missing after the fires had kind of subsided, and they eventually found Henry dead in the field. Originally, his death was ruled from heart failure. They basically said that he just had a heart attack or something like that and died. But later on, it was reported by some that Henry was found with bruises on the back of his head. And there was no autopsy conducted, so they really couldn't determine an official cause of death, but a lot of people think that Ed Geen ended up killing his brother Henry. About a year after the death of Henry, Geen's mother had a stroke, which left her pretty immobile, and that put more responsibility on Geen to not only take care of the farm and the property, but also to take care of his mother. Unfortunately, shortly after this first stroke, she suffered a second stroke, and she died from complications due to that. Now, a lot of people have said that his mother's death in particular was really traumatic for Ed Geen. Because his father was abusive, they didn't have a very close relationship. And some believe that Ed Geen may have been maybe jealous of his brother Henry for taking some of his mother's attention. But once Ed's mother died, he was basically alone on this really big farm. He had no family and he was kind of struggling financially. So this is where things really went downhill. Years down the road, Geen would confess that in this about 5-year period following his mother's death, he started visiting local graves. So he said that he would basically go in the middle of the night and that he wasn't fully aware of what he was doing. He was kind of in a stupor. He wasn't fully awake. He was just kind of dazed, and he would wander into these graveyards. And sometimes he would just visit and then leave empty-handed, but sometimes he would actually dig up the graves. He would either get in them, or he would actually take the bodies and return them to his farm. After he returned the bodies to his farm, he began a really disturbing process where he would remove the skin and then tan it. And he would specifically target the graves of middle-aged women who resembled his mother, because he said that his goal was to make a suit out of human skin so that he could climb inside of it and basically pretend that he was inside the body of his mother. Geen claimed that he performed these nightly graveyard visits for about 5 years following the death of his mother, but he's also been attributed to a number of other disappearances and killings in the period between that and 1957. Now, in 1957, Geen was finally discovered when the owner of a local hardware store went missing. The woman who owned the store was named Bernice Warden, and she disappeared on November 16th. Bernice's hardware store was closed on the day of November 16th, and while some thought it was strange, others said that it was pretty common for residents in Plainfield to close their businesses and go hunting or do other outdoor activities. So no one really thought much of it until the evening when she was still missing. Bernice's son, who was a deputy sheriff, ended up visiting the store, and inside he found the cash register open and blood on the floor. Now, Bernice's son had remembered that the evening before his mother's disappearance, a man had come into the hardware store, Ed Geen, and he had requested to buy a gallon of antifreeze. So Ed Geen had come in on November 15th and ordered this antifreeze, and he said that he was going to be back on the morning of the 16th to pick it up. This was confirmed through receipts of the transaction, and obviously police went to investigate Geen and eventually searched his farm. Now, when police searched Geen's farm, they made an incredibly disturbing discovery. They found Bernice's body on the property, hung upside down by the ankles, decapitated with her chest opened and dressed out like a deer. So it basically looked like he had hunted a deer and was dressing it and preparing the meat. They did end up determining that Bernice had died before the mutilation occurred, but it was still incredibly disturbing, and that was really just the surface of what they found. I'm going to read off some of the things that they found on the Geen property. Keep in mind this is really disturbing, so feel free to skip these next couple seconds if you like. But some of the things they found: chairs covered in human skin, masks made from female heads, several decapitated heads that were found in bags, noses, just cut off noses, I guess, a lampshade made from a human face, and this one is really bad, a belt that was made from female nipples. Now, on November 21st, Gein pled not guilty by reason of insanity. He ended up being diagnosed with schizophrenia and deemed unfit to stand trial, so he was sent to a state mental hospital. Although Gein was initially found unfit to stand trial, over a decade later in 1968, doctors ruled that Gein was actually competent enough to participate in his defense, so there was a trial in the case of Bernice Worden. Now, it's a little confusing, but there were essentially two trials. The first was to determine whether Gein was guilty of killing Bernice. Doctors said that Gein told them that he really couldn't remember if he had killed Bernice intentionally or accidentally. There's a lot of confusion around this, but he was basically saying that he had a gun. Sorry, that was my ice machine. That was so aggressive. But Gein basically said he had a gun and that he couldn't remember if he purposefully shot her or if it misfired and just happened to kill her. Regardless of this, Gein was found guilty for first-degree murder of Bernice Worden. And then the second trial began, which was to determine whether Gein was sane or not. In this trial, they determined that Gein was mentally insane, and they sentenced him to serve the rest of his life in a maximum security state mental hospital, which is where he ended up passing away a number of years later. It's also significant to note that the farm and property where these crimes occurred did end up burning down, and they were not able to determine an official cause. Some have said that it was an accident and that it was started by people who were cleaning the property or something like that. But others have said that it was intentional and that someone committed arson and burned it down. All in all, Gein served about 16 years in this mental hospital before dying in 1984 as a result of complications from lung cancer. Ed Gein is a notorious murderer because he committed such horrific crimes. It is unfortunate because he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, so mental illness obviously plays a part in his story, but there's really nothing that condones mutilating bodies and killing people and doing the things that he did. It is interesting to look at the parallels between Ed Gein's real life story and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre plot, and just see how Hooper was inspired and how he went on to create such an iconic horror movie. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe. Again, remember to check out episode 1, which covered The Shining, and stay tuned for the next episode. As always, if you have suggestions on movies you'd like me to cover, just drop a comment and I will add it to my list. But otherwise, I will see you guys next time.